In the grand halls of medieval castles, queens appeared like living icons of majesty. Draped in silks embroidered with threads of gold, crowned with jewels that glimmered in candlelight, they seemed to embody power itself. To the people they were figures of awe, the mothers of dynasties, the keepers of divine order, and symbols of stability in a turbulent world. Yet behind the jeweled diadems and public ceremonies, the secret lives of queens were far more complex, filled with fear, loneliness, scandal, and sacrifice. They were not merely the glittering ornaments of their kings, but women bound in webs of politics and expectation. Their hearts beating beneath the weight of crowns that often felt more like chains. To understand a queen's life, one must first grasp the world she lived in. In the Middle Ages, power was rarely shared equally between men and women. A king's authority came directly from God, or so it was proclaimed, while a queen's role was to serve as his consort, to bear heirs, and to act as a symbol of virtue. But within these narrow confines, queens carved out secret lives, hidden from the eyes of the chroniclers who so often sought to erase their voices. Behind the throne, they whispered counsel, brokered alliances, and, at times, plotted rebellions that would alter the fate of kingdoms. But this mask of majesty was carefully constructed. At coronations, queens were anointed with holy oil, seated beside their husbands in a display of shared sovereignty. Their images were etched in illuminated manuscripts, portrayed as serene and saintly, untouched by human weakness. Yet reality was far less divine. Queens were watched constantly, their every word and gesture scrutinized by courtiers eager to detect scandal or weakness. Their lives were theater, staged for the eyes of the court, while behind closed doors, their struggles unfolded unseen. For many queens, marriage was not the beginning of love, but the loss of freedom. Wed as teenagers to kings they barely knew, they were uprooted from their homelands and thrust into foreign courts, where they were surrounded by strangers, enemies, and spies. They were expected to embody loyalty, even when their husbands strayed openly with mistresses. They were expected to bear sons, even as their bodies were weakened by endless pregnancies and the threat of death in childbirth. And they were expected to suffer in silence, for a queen's grief was never hers alone. It was a matter of state. Some bore their burdens with patience, but others found ways to resist. Their secrets were not always about forbidden lovers or whispered plots, but about survival itself. Some queens hid their letters, advising allies in foreign lands. Others confided in trusted ladies-in-waiting, their words preserved only in rumor and song. A few dared to act boldly, wielding influence over councils, treasuries, and armies, while cloaked in the outward appearance of passive obedience. Theirs was a life of double roles, obedient consort by day, strategist by night. The secrecy was not only political, but deeply personal. The loneliness of queenship was a shadow rarely spoken of in chronicles. Surrounded by ladies and courtiers, yet never free from suspicion, queens often lived in gilded isolation. Every friend could be a spy, every servant a witness. Even their chambers, adorned with silken hangings, were not sanctuaries, but cages, watched by guards and governed by protocol. To show too much joy or sorrow was dangerous. The queen's mask had to remain flawless. And so many buried their emotions in silence, their true selves hidden even from those closest to them. Yet, paradoxically, it was this very secrecy that gave queens their power. By cloaking their desires, their fears, and their schemes, they created mysteries that fascinated their subjects and frightened their enemies. A queen's smile could inspire loyalty or suspicion. Her silence could be read as complicity or defiance. She wielded not the sword, but the subtler weapon of ambiguity, her secrets becoming the sharpest tool in her arsenal. Thus, the story of medieval queens is not only one of crowns and courts, but of masks and shadows. Their public image was majesty incarnate, but their hidden lives were filled with the struggles of women caught between expectation and desire, between loyalty and survival. To uncover these secret lives is to strip away the mask of majesty and see the human beneath the crown. A woman who loved, feared, schemed, and suffered just as much as the kings who stood beside her. In the medieval world, marriage was never simply a union of two hearts. It was a weapon, a contract of power, a political game played on a chessboard where queens were often the most valuable pieces. Behind every glittering wedding procession lay negotiations as cold and calculating as war councils. Daughters were promised as pawns, queens were forged as bridges between kingdoms, and women found themselves wielded as tools of diplomacy long before they ever wore a crown. A queen's marriage was almost always arranged from childhood. Betrothals were sealed while the girl was still in her cradle, her future already charted by fathers and kings eager to secure alliances. These unions could end centuries-long conflicts or ignite them anew if promises were broken. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Louis VII of France at 15, she brought with her one of the largest territories in Europe, making her as much a prize of conquest as a bride. Queens were rarely chosen for their beauty or temperament. They were chosen for the land, money, and influence sown into their dowries. For the women themselves, marriage was a severing as much as a beginning. They left behind the familiar warmth of their homes, their languages, and their mother's guidance to cross borders into courts where they were strangers. A foreign queen was expected to adapt instantly, to carry the customs of her new people, and to provide heirs that would bind her to the dynasty. Yet, she always remained an outsider, her loyalty often questioned, her every word weighed against suspicions of divided allegiance. Marriage was also a battlefield of expectations. A queen's most sacred duty was to bear sons, heirs to secure the future of dynasties. Each pregnancy was a test of worth, each daughter a disappointment, and each miscarriage a political disaster. Failure could mean disgrace, annulment, or worse, accusations of divine punishment. Queens lived with the terror that their wombs would define their legacies more than their minds or hearts ever could. For the kings, however, marriage was rarely a chain of fidelity. Kings took mistresses openly, parading their affairs before the court without fear of reproach. But if a queen so much as whispered affection outside her marriage, it was treated as treason, a crime punishable by death. This imbalance created not only bitterness, but deep undercurrents of danger. Queens learned to guard their emotions carefully, to feign indifference in the face of betrayal, and to bury their passions beneath layers of duty. Yet marriage, though forged as a weapon against queens, could also become their weapon of choice. A clever queen could use her role as wife to influence her husband's decisions, whispering counsel that shifted the course of battles and treaties. Some formed secret alliances with their children, turning their positions as mothers into political leverage. Marriage trapped them, but it also placed them at the very heart of power, closer to the throne than any general or advisor. But for all the crowns and jewels, queens lived in marriages haunted by uncertainty. A husband could discard his wife with the stroke of a quill, declaring annulment for reasons as trivial as too close kinship or failure to provide sons. The church, meant to sanctify these unions, often served as the instrument of their undoing. To be a queen was to live constantly on trial, judged not only by God and husband, but by the watching eyes of all Christendom. Thus, queenship was a paradox. Marriages meant to bind kingdoms together often broke the women at the center of them. The wedding vows spoken in Latin masked the reality of sacrifice, exile, and fear. Marriage was no union of equals. It was a battlefield where queens learned to survive, sometimes quietly, sometimes with fire, but always under the shadow of duty. And it was within this crucible that some queens began to find ways to turn their chains into weapons of their own. Among all medieval queens, few loom as large or as vividly as Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was not merely a consort, not merely a pawn on the chessboard of kings. She was a player in her own right, bold and cunning, shaping the course of Europe through sheer will and audacity. Born in 1122 into one of the wealthiest and most powerful duchies in France, Eleanor inherited Aquitaine at 15. With her lands stretching from the Loire Valley to the Pyrenees, she commanded resources and prestige rivaling that of any king. From the start, she was no ordinary woman. She was a prize, a threat, and a legend waiting to be written. At just 15, Eleanor married Louis VII of France and became queen. It was a union of immense power, but one that quickly soured. Louis was pious, cautious, and ill-suited to Eleanor's fiery spirit. Where he sought prayer and contemplation, she craved adventure and influence. Their marriage was tested when they joined the Second Crusade. Eleanor shocked Christendom by accompanying Louis to the Holy Land, leading her own retinue of knights and ladies, dressed in armor and commanding respect. Chroniclers marveled at her boldness, though whispers of scandal soon followed. Rumors spread that Eleanor grew dangerously close to her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, sparking suspicions that her loyalties strayed from both husband and crown. Their marriage fractured beyond repair. Eleanor and Louis had produced only daughters, a failure in the eyes of dynastic politics, and she used this as grounds to annul the marriage. Few queens dared such defiance, but Eleanor's independence was greater than Louis's authority. Within months of the annulment, she astonished Europe by marrying Henry Plantagenet, the future King Henry II of England. With that union, she carried Aquitaine across the Channel, reshaping the balance of power in Europe forever. With Henry, Eleanor seemed to have found her equal, fiery, ambitious, and ruthless. Together they built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, a domain so vast it dwarfed the holdings of the French crown. Eleanor bore Henry 8 children, securing the dynasty with heirs who would one day become Richard the Lionheart and King John. Yet even in this seemingly triumphant marriage, passion burned into fury. Henry's notorious infidelities humiliated Eleanor, and her pride could not bear the indignities of being cast aside, while mistresses flaunted their influence. Eleanor's response was nothing short of rebellion. Aligning with her sons, she encouraged them to rise against their father in a bid to seize power. This act of treachery was unprecedented for a queen, but Eleanor was not content to suffer in silence. She sought not only revenge for Henry's betrayals, but also freedom for herself and power for her heirs. The rebellion failed, and Henry, furious at her defiance, imprisoned Eleanor for 16 long years. Queens had been silenced before, but few endured so long in chains, watching from captivity as her children grew, fought, and schemed. Yet Eleanor's story did not end in a dungeon. When Henry died, her son Richard ascended the throne, and Eleanor was freed. In her 70s, she rode across Europe to secure alliances, arranged royal marriages, and governed in Richard's absence while he fought in the Crusades. Even in her old age, she was a force to be reckoned with, a queen who wielded her influence not from the shadows, but openly, unapologetically. Eleanor's life was extraordinary, not because she was a queen twice over, but because she defied the roles assigned to her. She was wife, mother, prisoner, and ruler, and in each role she refused to be silent. Chroniclers, some scandalized and others awestruck, could not ignore her. She embodied the contradictions of queenship. At once vulnerable and untouchable, bound by marriage, yet never conquered by it. Her legacy endures as one of the greatest queens in history, a woman who shaped nations not merely by bearing kings, but by defying them. The secret life of Eleanor of Aquitaine was no secret at all. It blazed across Europe, a story of passion, rebellion, and unyielding will. She was proof that even in a world built to silence women, a queen could be louder than the crowns she wore. If Eleanor of Aquitaine was remembered as a queen of brilliance and rebellion, Isabella of France carved her place in history as something darker, more fearsome, the she-wolf of France. Born the daughter of King Philip IV of France, she was married to Edward II of England in 1308, a union meant to bind two powerful kingdoms together. Instead, it became one of the most disastrous royal marriages in medieval history, consumed by betrayal, humiliation, and blood. At first glance, Isabella was the perfect queen, intelligent, beautiful, and skilled in diplomacy. Chroniclers praised her grace, and her marriage to Edward promised peace between France and England. But beneath the splendor of her coronation, trouble stirred. Edward was not the husband Isabella expected. From the very beginning, his heart belonged not to his bride, but to his favorite, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was showered with titles and gifts, flaunting his power in front of the court, while Isabella was pushed into the shadows. For a queen, humiliation of this kind was unbearable. Not only a personal insult, but a public betrayal of her dignity. When Gaveston was executed by rebellious nobles in 1312, Isabella might have hoped for reconciliation with her husband. Instead, another favorite rose to power, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had been arrogant, Despenser was ruthless. He monopolized Edward's affection, influence, and treasure, and treated Isabella with open contempt. Worse, Edward allowed it. He stripped Isabella of her lands, reduced her household, and even endangered her children's inheritance. For a queen, this was not merely cruelty, it was war against her very place at court. Isabella endured these insults for years, but her patience wore thin. The breaking point came when Edward, under Despenser's sway, confiscated Isabella's lands entirely and humiliated her publicly. The Queen of England, daughter of the most powerful king in Europe, was reduced to little more than a prisoner in her own court. In secret, Isabella began to weave her revenge. Her opportunity came when she was sent to France in 1325 to negotiate peace between her husband and her brother, the French king. Once in Paris, Isabella refused to return to England. There, free from Edward's control, she allied herself with Roger Mortimer, a disgraced English nobleman who had fled to France after rebelling against Edward. Mortimer became more than an ally. He became her lover, the partner she had been denied in her marriage. Together they plotted nothing less than the overthrow of the king. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small army. To the surprise of many, the people rallied to her cause. Years of resentment against Edward's misrule and Despenser's tyranny turned into open support for the queen. Within weeks, their forces grew, and Edward was abandoned by his allies. The Despensers were captured. Hugh the Younger was executed in a brutal display, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Edward himself was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, the young Edward III. But deposition was not enough. Edward II, the humiliated king, was imprisoned. and months later he was murdered in Berkeley Castle under mysterious and horrific circumstances. Rumors spread that he was killed with a red-hot poker, a gruesome end designed to mock his supposed sins. Whether this detail is true or legend, Isabella's shadow loomed over his death. The queen who had been humiliated now stood as victor, ruling England alongside her lover, Mortimer. For 4 years, Isabella and Mortimer wielded power, living in opulence and ruling as de facto monarchs. But their triumph bred resentment. Nobles who had supported Isabella turned against her, and her son, Edward III, now of age, seized control. Mortimer was executed, and Isabella was forced into a quiet exile. Though she lived out her days in relative comfort, her reputation was forever stained. Chroniclers called her the she-wolf, a queen who had devoured her husband and betrayed her crown. Yet Isabella's story is more than scandal and blood. She was a woman who refused to be silenced, who turned humiliation into rebellion, and who dared to seize power in a world that demanded her submission. To some, she remains a monster. To others, she is a symbol of defiance. In the secret life of Isabella of France, we glimpse the raw truth of queenship, that beneath the silks and jewels, a queen could be as ruthless, as cunning, and as dangerous as any king. In a world where queens were bound by duty, their hearts were often the most dangerous rebels. If a queen strayed beyond the boundaries of her marriage, it was not merely scandal, it was treason. Her body carried the future of dynasties, her womb the legitimacy of kings. And so every whisper of desire outside of wedlock threatened not just her crown, but the very stability of a kingdom. Yet the heart cannot always be silenced. Behind the velvet curtains of courts, amid the shadows of candle-lit chambers, queens sometimes risked everything for forbidden love. Unlike kings, whose affairs were tolerated and even celebrated, queens bore the crushing weight of double standards. A king could take mistresses without consequence. A queen caught in an affair risked death. Yet this inequality did not extinguish passion. It only made it more dangerous. Rumors of queens' secret loves haunt the chronicles of Europe, each story a blend of fact, fear, and whispered scandal. Some were guilty, others were victims of political slander, but all reveal how perilous desire could be when bound in a crown. Take the case of Margaret of Anjou, queen to Henry VI of England. Fierce and intelligent, she effectively ruled in her husband's stead when his bouts of madness left him incapable. But whispers spread that her son, Edward of Westminster, wasn't truly the king's child, but the bastard of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, her close ally. Historians still debate the truth, but in the eyes of her enemies, the accusation alone was enough. Margaret's love, or the suspicion of it, was used to paint her as an adulteress and a traitor, fueling the fires of the Wars of the Roses. In this way, desire became not just personal, but political ammunition. Other tales are even darker. Queens accused of adultery often faced brutal punishment. In France, Isabeau of Bavaria, wife of Charles VI, was slandered with accusations of incest and infidelity, charges crafted to undermine her regency while her husband languished in madness. Whether true or false, the stain of desire clung to her name, weaponized by rivals eager to strip her of influence. The very suggestion that a queen's heart had wandered was enough to shatter her reputation forever. Yet not all was rumor. Some queens did dare to love outside of their marriages, even if only for fleeting moments. Chronicles speak of queens who exchanged secret letters, who lingered too long in the company of knights, who risked clandestine meetings in gardens or chapels. Their stories are harder to trace, for they were often buried by official histories. But the troubadours' songs, filled with veiled allegories of ladies and knights, hint that such affairs were far more common than the record admits. Where history is silent, poetry fills the void, preserving the longing that dared not speak its name. The punishment for forbidden desire was merciless. A queen accused of adultery could be imprisoned, divorced, or executed. Her lover, if discovered, faced the sword or the noose. Sometimes, as in the case of Isabella of France's husband, Edward II, the betrayal went further. His alleged preference for male favorites humiliated his queen and sparked the fury that ended his reign. Love outside of duty was more than scandal. It was political dynamite, capable of toppling monarchs and igniting wars. And yet, despite the risks, queens' forbidden desires left behind a legacy that outlived their punishments. They became the fuel of legend, woven into plays, ballads, and later, novels. The image of a queen risking everything for love became a symbol of both tragedy and strength. Their passion defied the iron cages of duty, and even in failure, they proved that queens were not mere pawns of kings. They were women who could feel as deeply and risk as boldly as any warrior on the battlefield. Thus, the forbidden desires of queens remind us that even within the most gilded prisons, the heart beat loudly. It beat in defiance of crowns, in defiance of laws, and in defiance of death itself. And though their secrets were often buried in silence, the echoes remain, haunting the very walls of castles that once tried to contain them. To be a queen was to live forever between extremes, revered as a mother of dynasties, entrusted as regent of kingdoms, yet vulnerable to fall as prisoner of her own crown. No role better revealed the contradictions of queenship than these three: the mother, the regent, and the captive. Within them lay both the power and peril of queens' secret lives. Motherhood was a queen's most sacred duty, for through her womb the future of kingdoms was secured. Sons were celebrated as heirs, while daughters were bartered away in marriage, their bodies and futures spent like currency. Every pregnancy was watched with anxious eyes, every birth a matter of state. When a queen bore sons, she was exalted, praised as a vessel chosen by God. When she bore only daughters, or when tragedy struck and children died in infancy, blame often fell upon her shoulders. For some queens, like Catherine of Aragon centuries later, the inability to produce a male heir became the cruel measure of their worth, stripping them of love, dignity, and even crowns. But queens were not only mothers of children, they were mothers of kingdoms. When kings were absent on crusade, or captured in battle, or when heirs were too young to rule, queens often stepped into the role of regent. It was a role both empowering and dangerous. As regents, queens commanded councils, dispensed justice, raised armies, and balanced fragile alliances. In these moments, they proved that women could govern as capably as men, though their authority was always challenged, always precarious. A queen regent walked a knife's edge, praised when successful, vilified as ambitious when she reached too far. One striking example is Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France. When her son ascended the throne as a boy, Blanche ruled as regent with firm resolve. She faced rebellions, negotiated treaties, and kept France stable during a volatile era. Chroniclers recorded her strength, though often with unease at a woman wielding such authority. She showed the paradox of queenship, that while women were expected to be submissive, the survival of kingdoms often depended on their rule. Yet the power of regency came with its shadow: imprisonment. A queen who misstepped, or whose ambitions threatened others, could find herself locked behind the same walls that once glorified her. Isabella of France, triumphant after the fall of Edward II, tasted power as regent for her son, only to be cast aside and confined when Edward III claimed his throne. Eleanor of Aquitaine, once the most powerful woman in Europe, spent 16 years in captivity after rebelling against Henry II. To be queen was to live one heartbeat away from glory and the next from chains. Imprisoned queens often endured their captivity in silence, but some fought even from their cells. Letters smuggled out, alliances whispered through bars, sons and daughters stirred to action on their behalf. A queen in prison was never only a victim. She was a symbol. Her confinement could rally rebels, her suffering become a rallying cry. The very walls meant to silence her could magnify her voice, turning her into a legend. The contradiction was sharp. Queens were exalted as mothers, entrusted as regents, yet punished more cruelly than kings when accused of betrayal. A man might be deposed, exiled, or forgiven. A queen was caged, erased, or broken. And yet, their resilience shines through history. They bore children, they ruled in crisis, they endured captivity, and in doing so, they proved that queenship was never passive. It was a battlefield as brutal as any fought with swords. In their secret lives, queens balanced love for their children with the hunger for power, the duty to govern with the fear of downfall. They were mothers, but never only mothers, regents, but never fully free, prisoners, but never fully silenced. Through these roles, they carved their legacies, not as shadows of their husbands, but as women who bore the weight of kingdoms and the scars of crowns. When we imagine war in the Middle Ages, we picture kings in gleaming armor, knights charging with lances and banners snapping in the wind. Yet behind many of these battles stood queens, sometimes rallying forces in their husband's absence, sometimes defending their children's inheritance, and sometimes waging war in their own name. Far from being silent consorts, queens often proved themselves as warriors of spirit, commanding from castle walls, negotiating with generals, and even riding into the fray. Their secret lives at war revealed not fragility, but a fierce strength that could change the course of kingdoms. Eleanor of Aquitaine, long remembered for her political brilliance, also stood as an emblem of martial courage. During the Second Crusade, she rode with her own retinue of knights, scandalizing Europe by donning armor and taking part in strategy discussions. Chroniclers accused her of overstepping, but the truth is clear. She was no passive queen watching from afar, but a leader willing to march across continents. Her example was echoed by queens who, in times of crisis, seized the mantle of command when men faltered. One of the most striking examples was Matilda of England, known as Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry III. When her cousin Stephen seized the throne in 1135, Matilda fought for her right to rule in a civil war that tore England apart. For years, she led armies, held castles, and negotiated alliances. Though chroniclers mocked her as proud and unfeminine, she came closer to the throne than any woman before her, and through her son, Henry II, she founded the Plantagenet dynasty. Her struggle showed that a queen, or would-be queen, could stand toe-to-toe with men in the brutal theater of war. Queens did not always ride into battle, but their presence at sieges was pivotal. Isabella of Castile, though later in history, set a medieval precedent by appearing on the front lines with her troops during the Reconquista. Earlier, in France, Blanche of Castile defended her son Louis IX's throne by rallying troops against rebellious nobles. Her resolve in the face of treachery kept the monarchy intact, and her image as a warrior mother became legendary. These women proved that the battlefield was not defined by gender, but by will. War also tested queens in moments of siege. Castles were not merely stone fortresses, but homes, and often prisons, for queens left behind while kings rode to battle. When enemies surrounded their walls, queens became commanders by necessity. Chronicles tell of women who organized defenses, distributed supplies, and rallied terrified garrisons. Margaret of Anjou, fierce queen of Henry VI, repeatedly defended her husband's crown in the Wars of the Roses, riding at the head of her armies and refusing to bow even as defeat piled upon defeat. Her enemies called her a she-wolf, but her courage was undeniable. Yet queens at war were often trapped in the cruelest paradox. Their bravery could inspire loyalty, but it could just as easily provoke resentment. To some chroniclers, a queen who fought was unnatural, usurping the place of men. To others, she was a savior. Their reputations swung wildly, depending on victory or defeat. A victorious queen was a hero. A defeated queen was a monster. Few kings endured such extremes of judgment. The secret lives of queens at war were marked not only by steel and fire, but by calculation. Many wars were won not by sword, but by treaty. And here queens shone as negotiators. Their marriages had trained them in diplomacy. Their status as mothers gave them leverage. They arranged truces, secured alliances, and sometimes betrayed one side for another, always walking the razor's edge between survival and ruin. Queens at war remind us that medieval women were not confined to silence and embroidery. They could be rulers, rebels, commanders, and defenders, carrying the weight of kingdoms in times of chaos. Their stories, often buried beneath tales of kings and knights, reveal the raw truth. That war was not only a man's world. Queens bled for crowns, fought for dynasties, and left behind legacies carved in both steel and stone. If battlefields were drenched in blood and glory, the courts of medieval Europe were no less deadly, though their weapons were whispers, daggers in the dark, and cups of poisoned wine. For queens, court life was a maze of treachery, where every ally could turn into an enemy, and every smile might conceal a plot. Behind the glittering banquets and elaborate ceremonies, intrigue thrived, and betrayal waited in the shadows. The chalice a queen lifted to her lips might be filled with wine, or with death. Queens were often at the center of this dangerous web. Their positions made them powerful, but also vulnerable, as rivals sought to weaken their influence or destroy them outright. In France, Isabeau of Bavaria became infamous not only for political turmoil during her husband Charles VI's madness, but also for accusations of corruption, betrayal, and even poisoning. Many of these charges were exaggerations or fabrications, yet they reveal how easily a queen could be painted as the mastermind of intrigue, whether guilty or not. Poison, in particular, haunted the courts. Chronicles whisper of queens accused of slipping deadly powders into chalices to rid themselves of rivals or enemies. Catherine de' Medici, though from a later age, inherited a legacy of suspicion from these medieval fears. Even when a queen was innocent, her enemies might accuse her of poison simply to blacken her reputation. The fear of treachery at the table was so strong that food tasters became essential in royal households, their lives sacrificed to guard the queens and kings. Beyond poison, betrayal came in the form of courtiers, ambitious nobles, scheming advisors, and even mistresses who vied for power. Queens were often forced to compete with their husbands' favorites, women who wielded influence without bearing crowns. Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France, was adored by the king, but despised by many at court. Her sudden death at just 28, rumored to be by poison, reminds us how easily jealousy and ambition could end in tragedy. For queens, the presence of mistresses was not only humiliating but politically threatening, for it shifted royal favor and weakened their own authority. But queens too could master the game of intrigue. Some learned to weave networks of loyal allies, exchanging favors, marriages, and secrets to maintain their place. A whispered word in the right ear could topple a rival. A forged letter could spark rebellion. Court life demanded subtlety, and queens who survived longest were those who mastered the art of survival in silence. Yet betrayal was not confined to strangers. Queens were often betrayed by those closest to them, ladies-in-waiting who spied for enemies, children who turned against their mothers, or husbands who stripped them of lands and power. Isabella of France's humiliation by Edward II was not merely marital, it was betrayal of her queenship itself, her role trampled by Despenser's rise. The personal and the political blurred until every slight became a wound with kingdom-wide consequences. The court itself became a stage for this constant play of deception. Ceremonies, jousts, and banquets were not merely celebrations, but displays of power where every gesture was political theater. To falter was to give rivals a weapon. To shine too brightly was to provoke envy. A queen drank from her chalice with poise, knowing the eyes of all were upon her, wondering if the next sip would be her last. In this world of silks and daggers, the poisoned chalice became a symbol of queenship itself. Beautiful, glittering, and deadly. It reminded every queen that her crown was not protection, but peril, her court not sanctuary, but battlefield. And yet, many endured, some even thrived, proving themselves masters of intrigue as well as of majesty. For in the medieval court, to survive betrayal was to be stronger than any army, and to drink deeply from danger was the price of wearing the crown. Queens were surrounded by splendor, golden chalices, silken gowns, and halls that echoed with music and ceremony. Yet within these towering stone walls, many lived lives of profound loneliness. The throne, though draped in velvet and crowned with jewels, was in truth a lonely seat, a place where isolation gnawed at the soul as surely as chains. For queens, the court was not always a place of companionship. It was a stage of endless performance, where trust was scarce and solitude was constant. The root of this loneliness lay in suspicion. Queens were never truly free to choose their confidants. Every lady-in-waiting, every chambermaid, every advisor was a potential spy, servants of ambitious nobles, or worse, agents of foreign courts. A careless word, an intimate confession, even a sigh could be carried beyond the chamber walls, twisted into scandal or treason. Thus, many queens learned to guard their tongues, smiling in public while burying their sorrows in silence. Marriage did not often soothe this isolation. For many queens, their husbands were distant or unfaithful, bound to them not by love, but by duty. Kings took mistresses without shame, filling the court with rivals who flaunted their influence. Meanwhile, the queen was expected to suffer in silence, her heart's longings unspoken. Even queens with devoted husbands found themselves alone in other ways, as kings departed for war or crusades, leaving their consorts in castles haunted by absence and uncertainty. Motherhood, though a source of joy, also deepened the solitude. Children of queens were rarely truly theirs. Sons were claimed by tutors, guardians, and advisors, raised not in the warmth of family, but in the cold demands of kingship. Daughters were bartered into foreign marriages, torn from their mother's arms before they reached womanhood. Queens, who risked their lives in childbirth, were too often left to grieve alone when death claimed their infants. An all too common fate in a world where disease spared few. The court itself offered little comfort. Though filled with pageantry, it was also a nest of vipers. Rival noblewomen whispered, courtiers schemed, and chroniclers watched with quills poised to record every misstep. A queen might host grand feasts and dazzling dances, but behind her mask of majesty, she carried a heart that longed for sincerity, a rare treasure in the world of politics. And yet, within this loneliness, some queens found strength. Solitude sharpened their minds, teaching them patience and resilience. In private chambers, they read letters, studied scripture, or wrote secret correspondence to allies beyond the castle walls. Their isolation became a crucible, forging a harder will. Queens like Blanche of Castile or Margaret of Anjou turned loneliness into strategy, using their quiet hours not for despair, but for plotting the survival of their sons and the endurance of their dynasties. But others broke beneath the weight of isolation. Some retreated into piety, seeking solace in prayer and confessors. Others turned bitter, their loneliness curdling into suspicion and rage, lashing out against courtiers and rivals. A few embraced forbidden loves, seeking in passion the warmth denied them by cold thrones and colder marriages. In each case, the loneliness of queens was never passive. It shaped them, twisted them, or strengthened them, leaving marks that would shape kingdoms as well. The lonely throne is perhaps the most human secret of queenship. Beneath the crown sat not only rulers and symbols, but women, longing, grieving, and enduring. Their isolation, hidden behind tapestries and ceremonies, reminds us that power does not banish loneliness. Indeed, it often magnifies it, turning gilded halls into echoing prisons. And yet, in that solitude, many queens discovered their truest selves, their resilience forged in silence, their legacies born not only from triumph, but from endurance in loneliness. The lives of medieval queens were tapestries woven from threads of power, sacrifice, intrigue, and sorrow. They stood at the center of kingdoms, crowned with majesty, yet burdened by isolation, betrayal, and the crushing weight of expectation. To the world, they were symbols of grace and stability. To themselves, they were women forced to balance love, duty, and survival in a world that rarely forgave their missteps. And though centuries have passed, their legacies continue to shape how we imagine both power and womanhood. What made their lives unforgettable was not simply their crowns, but their contradictions. Queens were both exalted and imprisoned, adored and despised, praised for producing heirs and condemned when they failed. They were pawns in political marriages, yet some turned those marriages into weapons of influence. They were silenced by husbands and courts, yet their whispers carried enough force to topple kings. Their power was often hidden, their struggles often erased, but in every shadow, they left marks that could not be forgotten. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, lived boldly, refusing to accept silence. She shaped 2 kingdoms, defied 2 kings, and became the mother of dynasties. Others, like Isabella of France, embraced ruthlessness, turning humiliation into rebellion, carving her place in history as the she-wolf of England. Still others, like Blanche of Castile, proved that queens could rule as capably as kings, guiding kingdoms through crisis with a steady hand. Each in her own way redefined what it meant to wear a crown. Their legacies were not only political, but deeply human. They were mothers who grieved for lost children, wives who endured betrayal, and women who longed for affection in courts that offered only suspicion. Their secret lives remind us that beneath the crowns were hearts that beat with passion, fear, and resilience. They remind us that power, even wrapped in gold and velvet, does not shield one from loneliness or pain. And yet, it is precisely because of these struggles that their stories endure. The world remembers not only their triumphs, but their tragedies, not only their crowns, but their scars. Their lives became the substance of legend, fueling chronicles, ballads, and later, the imagination of novelists and filmmakers. We are drawn to them because they embody the eternal paradox of power. The greater the crown, the greater the peril. In the end, the legacy of medieval queens lies not only in the thrones they sat upon, but in the courage with which they bore them. They endured humiliations, betrayals, and prisons, yet they also shaped dynasties, led armies, and defied kings. Their lives show us that queenship was never passive, never ornamental. It was a battlefield every bit as dangerous as the clash of swords, and in many ways, more enduring. Today, when we gaze upon the ruined castles and faded portraits of these women, we do not see silent figures frozen in history. We see resilience, strategy, longing, and fire. We see women who lived in a world determined to silence them, and who nevertheless found ways to make their voices echo across centuries. Their crowns may have glittered in candlelight, but it was their hidden strength, their secret lives, that left the truest mark on history. Thus, the story of medieval queens is not only one of power and pageantry, but of survival and defiance. Their legacies remind us that even in the darkest ages, women shaped the fate of kingdoms. And though their thrones were lonely, their voices still resound, carrying across the centuries to remind us that majesty is never without its shadow, and that the secrets of queens will forever captivate the world.